we are going to talk about how to find the domain of a function. So in order to find something, we first need to know what we're looking for. So what is the domain? The domain is all the values that go into a function. For some functions, when they give us the equation of the function, they will also give us the domain of the function. And that means that the domain is already defined. But if the domain is not already defined, then we're going to say that the domain is the largest set of real numbers that results in real numbers as outputs from our function. So in other words, we're going to say it's every x value that we can put into our function and get a real number output. So how do we find the domain? Well, we want to find the domain by finding which values are not in our domain. And in order to do that, we're going to look for two things. We're going to look for when we're dividing by zeros and when we're square roots of negatives. So any x values that make us do this during our function means that we're not going to get a real number, and then those x values cannot be part of our domain. And then our domain is going to be everything except for those x values that cause problems. So let's try an example on how to find the domain. We have f of x equals 1 over 1 minus x squared. So we want to identify where there might be issues. Since we have a fraction and we have an x value on the bottom of our fraction, there may be some x values which make it true so that we're dividing by 0, which is bad. That's one of those things we wanted to look for. So we want to solve for when the bottom is equal to 0. So we're going to write a little equation. We're going to do 1 minus x squared equals 0. So we're just going to take whatever's the bottom of our fraction and set it equal to 0. Now we're going to solve for x by subtracting by 1, dividing by -1, and then taking the square root, and we get x equals 1 and x equals -1. So these x values mean that if we plug in 1 or -1 for x, we'll get a 0 on the bottom, and that's bad, so we can't have 1 or -1 in our domain. However, everything else can be in our domain, so we want to write our domain in such a way that it's everything excluding those two things. In order to do that, let's look at a number line. We're going to say not -1 and not 1, but we're going to do everything less than -1, everything in between them, and everything greater than 1. And now in order to write this, we're going to do negative infinity to -1, which gets all the lower ones. We're going to use a parenthesis on -1 because we're not including it. Then we're going to union that with -1 to 1, again parentheses because we're not including those. And then 1 to infinity, and again parentheses on that 1 because we're not including 1. Now this captures all of the numbers except for -1 and 1, just like we want. And remember, we don't put parentheses on negative infinity because we can never really include infinity since they're just really big numbers. So let's try another example. We have f of x equals the square root of x over x squared plus x minus 6. So we want to find where there might be issues. Our two issues were if they were dividing by 0, so we can see that we have some x's on the bottom and that's going to cause some issues, or if we're taking the square root of a negative number. So looking at the top, we have a square root there, and we want to never take the square root of a negative number. So we can see that the square root will be negative if x is ever negative itself. So x needs to be greater than be 0 or greater, because we can't take the square root of 0. That's not an issue as long as x isn't negative. Now we want to solve the bottom for when we're dividing by 0, so we'll do x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. Then we're going to factor that, so we get x plus 3 times by x minus 2 equals 0. And then we will take x plus 3 equals 0, so x equals -3, x minus 2 equals 0, and then x equals 2. So now we can see that these are our cases which are not in our domain. So our domain does not include when x is less than 0, when x equals -3, or when x equals 2. So again, we just have that written here, but everything else is going to be in our domain. So let's look at our number line again, and let's do the numbers we're excluding. So it cannot equal -3, it cannot equal 2, and we are including 0, so I'm going to use a bracket, but it's going to have to be everything greater than 0. So we're going to go from 0 to 2, and then from 2 to infinity. So we're not going to include that 2, and we don't have to worry about the -3 because we're already not including it when we're saying x has to be greater than 0. So now our domain can be written as 0 to 2. We're using a bracket on 0 because we are including 0, and then we're going to use a parentheses on 2 because we're not including it, and then union that with 2 to infinity because we want all the bigger numbers bigger than 2 as well. So that is how you find the domain of a function. Sometimes your functions get a little more complicated than the ones we use today, but it's still the same idea. You want to look for square roots and dividing by 0, and if you don't have any of those issues, then you don't have an issue with your domain.